Ethan had spent his entire life chasing an idea of success that always seemed just beyond his reach. From the time he was a child, he had been taught that hard work was the answer to everything. His parents, who had sacrificed their own dreams to build a stable life, had instilled in him the belief that effort was the only thing that mattered. If he worked tirelessly, if he dedicated himself fully, if he gave up distractions and focused solely on his goals, then success would come. He had carried that belief into adulthood like a sacred truth, never questioning it, never allowing himself to doubt that all of his sacrifices would eventually pay off. But now, standing in his small apartment, staring out at the city skyline that had once filled him with ambition, he felt nothing but exhaustion. He had done everything right. He had followed every rule. He had pushed himself harder than anyone he knew, spent sleepless nights chasing deadlines, sacrificed relationships in the name of progress, and poured every ounce of his energy into his work. And yet, despite all of it, he was still standing in the same place, looking at a future that felt no closer than it had years ago. The truth was unbearable to admit. He wasn't failing because he wasn't trying hard enough. He wasn't struggling because he lacked discipline. He had done everything he was supposed to do. And yet success remained elusive, taunting him like a shadow that disappeared the moment he got close. He had watched others, some who seemed to work half as hard, achieve what he had spent years pursuing. He had scrolled through images of former classmates traveling the world, starting families, building lives that seemed rich with meaning, while he remained trapped in the endless cycle of work and exhaustion. He told himself it would all be worth it in the end. But what if there was no end? What if he had spent all these years chasing something that didn't exist? For the first time, the thought truly terrified him. He had built his entire identity around the pursuit of success, convinced that once he reached a certain level of achievement, he would finally feel whole. But what if success wasn't something that could ever be reached? What if it wasn't a finish line waiting in the distance but something entirely different from what he had imagined? He felt the weight of years pressing down on him. The exhaustion was no longer just physical, it was something deeper. Something that settled in his chest like a dull ache. He had spent so long running that he had never stopped to ask himself why. He had never considered whether the version of success he was chasing was even one he truly wanted, or if it was simply an idea he had inherited from a world that valued productivity above all else. He thought about quitting, but the thought alone made him feel empty. He didn't want to give up, didn't want to walk away from the dreams he had spent so long building. But he also couldn't keep moving in the same direction, couldn't keep pushing himself towards something that no longer felt real. There had to be another way. That night, unable to quiet the thoughts racing through his mind, he remembered a conversation he had overheard years ago. A friend had spoken of a man named Elias, a mentor who had helped countless people uncover the truth about success, who had guided those who were lost towards something deeper than achievement alone. At the time, Ethan had dismissed the idea. He hadn't believed in the need for guidance. He had been certain that he already knew what it took to succeed. But now, with everything he thought he knew crumbling around him, he found himself drawn to the possibility that there was an answer he hadn't yet discovered. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he couldn't keep living like this. If there was even the slightest chance that this man had the answers he needed, he had to find out for himself. The next morning, he packed a small bag and set off. He left behind the constant hum of the city, the deadlines, the pressure, the feeling of being trapped in a race with no finish line. The further he traveled, the quieter the world became. The towering skyscrapers gave way to open fields. The constant noise of his daily life faded into silence. He had spent years moving at a relentless pace, always in a hurry, always thinking about the next step, the next milestone. Now, for the first time, he was simply present. And though he didn't yet have the answers, Though he didn't know what he would find, there was something freeing about the uncertainty. As he approached the retreat where Elias was said to reside, he felt something unfamiliar stir within him, not hope. Not yet. But the smallest sense of possibility. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps success was not what he had always believed it to be. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, he was finally ready to understand what it truly meant. Ethan had imagined many things about the place he was traveling to. He had pictured an imposing temple, grand and structured, a place that radiated wisdom through towering walls and intricate carvings. He had expected something that mirrored the weight of the questions he carried. Something that would make him feel small in its vastness. Something that would assure him that the answers he sought were held within its walls. But when he arrived, he found none of that. The retreat was simple, almost unremarkable. A collection of modest buildings nestled among towering trees. A quiet river winding its way through the landscape. There were no grand gates. No symbols of mastery or enlightenment. No indication that this was a place where people came to seek the kind of wisdom that could change lives. Yet there was something about it. Something in the way the air felt different here. In the way the silence wasn't empty but full. As if it carried unspoken truths waiting to be understood. He walked through the retreat with measured steps, unsure of what he was looking for. The people who passed him moved with an ease that unsettled him. They were not rushing. They were not burdened by the same urgency he had carried for so long. He wondered if they had already found the answers he was still searching for. If they had once arrived here feeling as lost as he did now. It didn't take long to find Elias. He was sitting by the river, cross-legged on a worn stone. His posture relaxed yet deliberate. His presence was quiet but undeniable. As if the space around him had been carved by years of stillness. He did not look like a man who had unlocked the secrets of success. Nor did he resemble the figures Ethan had always associated with achievement. He was not commanding in the way leaders were. Not authoritative in the way mentors often seemed to be. And yet, there was something about him. Something steady. Something unshakable. Ethan hesitated before stepping forward, suddenly aware of how out of place he must seem here. He had spent years building a version of himself that thrived in movement, in progress, in measurable outcomes. Standing in front of a man who seemed to exist outside of all of that. He felt stripped bare, as though every carefully constructed piece of himself had been rendered irrelevant. He had come here seeking answers. But now that he was here, he wasn't sure where to begin. Elias looked up and met his gaze. His eyes carrying none of the judgment Ethan had expected. There was no impatience. No questioning of why he had come. Only quiet acknowledgement. As if he already understood why Ethan was here. As if he had met countless others before him who had arrived carrying the same weight. The same questions. The same restless hunger for something more. Ethan cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong," he said. The words coming out quieter than he intended. "I've done everything I was supposed to do. I've worked harder than anyone I know. I've sacrificed everything to get to where I am. And yet, I'm stuck. I'm exhausted. And I don't know why." Elias studied him for a long moment before he spoke. "You believe that hard work should lead to success," he said. "You believe that effort alone is the answer." Ethan felt frustration rise in his chest. "Isn't it?" he asked. "That's what I was taught. That's what I've built my life around. If I just keep pushing, if I keep sacrificing, eventually, I'll get there." Elias tilted his head slightly. "And yet, here you are." The words were simple, but they hit Ethan with the weight of something undeniable. He had no argument against them. He was here because something was broken. Because something wasn't working. And despite everything in him that wanted to push back, he couldn't deny that his approach had led him to exhaustion. Not to the success he had imagined. Elias gestured for him to sit, and Ethan lowered himself onto the grass, unsure of what to expect. The river moved gently beside them, the sound of it steady, rhythmic. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan was used to filling silence with explanations, with justifications, with strategies for how to move forward. But here, the silence did not demand anything from him. It simply existed, unhurried and patient. Finally, Elias spoke. "You are not the first to come here carrying these questions," he said. "And you will not be the last. The world has taught you that success is something you must chase, something you must fight for, something that exists only as a reward for suffering. You have spent your life running towards something, believing that if you stop, even for a moment, you will fall behind." Ethan swallowed, because every word felt like an unspoken truth he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. Elias continued, "But tell me, have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what is it that you are actually chasing?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had spent years convinced that he knew the answer. Success. Achievement. The life he had always envisioned. But now, faced with the question, he wasn't sure. Was it success that he wanted? Or was it the feeling he believed success would give him? Was it accomplishment itself? Or was it the idea that once he achieved enough, he would finally feel worthy? Finally feel at peace? Elias watched him carefully, as if he could see the war unfolding inside him. "There is nothing wrong with ambition," he said. "There is nothing wrong with wanting more. But what you must ask yourself is whether the path you are on is leading you to what you truly seek, or if it is simply leading you in circles." Ethan let out a slow breath. He had never questioned the path. He had never questioned anything. He had only moved forward, convinced that movement itself was the answer. But now, he wasn't so sure. Elias studied him for a moment longer before standing. "Come," he said. "There is something I want you to do." Ethan hesitated but followed, something in him telling him that whatever was coming next would change everything. Ethan followed Elias through the quiet retreat, his mind still lingering on the question that had been left hanging between them. What was he really chasing? He had always thought the answer was obvious. Success. Growth. The kind of achievement that set people apart. But now, as he walked behind Elias, the certainty he had once held so tightly began to unravel. Maybe it wasn't success itself he had been chasing, but the feeling he believed it would bring. Maybe it wasn't about reaching some external milestone, but about proving something to himself. They reached an open courtyard where the late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the worn stone beneath their feet. In the center of the space, Elias stopped and turned to face him. In his hands, he held a small, delicate cup filled to the brim with water. Without a word, he extended it toward Ethan. "Take this," Elias said, "and walk the length of the retreat without spilling a drop." Ethan hesitated before taking the cup. He wasn't sure what he had expected from Elias, but it hadn't been this. He had come here looking for answers, for wisdom, for something profound that would finally unlock the success that had eluded him. But instead, he was being asked to complete a task that felt almost too simple, too mundane to mean anything. Still, he had spent his entire life following instructions, proving himself through discipline and precision. He wouldn't fail at something as straightforward as this. He gripped the cup carefully, steadying his hands, and took his first step. Immediately, his world shrank. All of his attention funneled into the small, trembling surface of the water. Every movement had to be controlled, every breath measured. He kept his pace slow, his focus sharp. The ground beneath him, the rustling of the leaves, the voices in the distance, none of it existed. There was only the cup, the water, and the pressure to keep it still. The path wound through the retreat. Past gardens he didn't look at. Under trees he didn't notice. Through spaces filled with life he ignored completely. His body was tense with concentration. Every step was deliberate. He moved as if any disruption, any lapse in focus, would result in failure. He didn't know why this task mattered, but he was determined to complete it perfectly. When he reached Elias again, he let out a slow breath, holding the cup up in triumph. The water remained untouched, not a single drop lost. He waited for approval, for acknowledgement that he had done well. Elias studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Tell me," he said, "what did you see along your walk?" Ethan frowned. "I wasn't paying attention to anything else. I was focused on the water." Elias nodded, as if he had expected this. "Go again," he said. "But this time, take in everything around you. Notice the details. See the retreat. However, still, do not spill the water." Ethan exhaled, taking the cup once more. This time, he lifted his eyes as he walked. He noticed the colors of the flowers lining the path, the way the petals caught the light. He saw the intricate carvings on the stone walls, the subtle signs of time woven into their surface. He heard the laughter of children in the distance, the soft murmur of conversation, the rustling of wind moving through the trees. For the first time since arriving, he felt truly present. But when he returned to Elias, he looked down and saw what he already knew: several drops of water had spilled. He let out a quiet sigh, feeling the weight of both attempts pressing against him. "I wasn't able to do both," he admitted. "I paid attention to what was around me, but I couldn't keep the water from spilling." Elias smiled. "And that," he said, "is the lesson." Ethan felt something shift inside him. Something that wasn't frustration or disappointment, but recognition. "You have spent your life like you did on your first walk," Elias continued, "focused entirely on one thing: your goals, your achievements. The idea that success is something you must reach without distraction, without deviation. But in doing so, you have missed the world around you. You have sacrificed presence for progress, believing that if you loosen your grip, if you look away even for a moment, you will fail." Ethan swallowed, because the truth of those words settled too deeply for him to deny. But when you walked with awareness, when you allowed yourself to see, to hear, to experience, what happened? Elias asked. "I lost some of the water," Ethan admitted. Elias nodded. "Because balance is not about perfection. It is about learning how to hold both. If you focus only on the journey, you will lose your purpose. If you focus only on the goal, you will lose the journey. True success is not in sacrificing one for the other. It is in learning how to carry both." Ethan felt the full weight of the lesson settle over him. It wasn't a strategy, wasn't a formula for achievement. It was something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to understand. Success was not about relentless pursuit at the cost of everything else. It was about moving with awareness, about understanding that ambition and presence were not opposing forces, but two sides of the same truth. For the first time in his life, he saw his past for what it was. He had spent years walking a path where nothing existed beyond the next step forward. He had convinced himself that if he could just keep the water steady, if he could just hold on tightly enough, he would finally feel whole. But in doing so, he had missed so much. Now, standing here with Elias, he understood something he never had before. Success was not just about keeping the water from spilling. It was about learning how to walk without losing sight of everything else. And for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to move through life with that kind of balance. Elias watched him for a moment before speaking again. "This is only the beginning," he said. "The real work is not in understanding the lesson. but in learning how to live it. Ethan looked down at the cup in his hands, the few drops of water that had escaped, and knew that he was finally ready to try. Ethan stood there, the weight of Elias's words settling in his mind like ripples across still water. His entire life, he had believed in absolutes: work hard, stay focused, push forward, and success would be inevitable. But here, standing in the presence of a man who seemed to know truths he had never considered, he felt a quiet unraveling inside him. Something he had always held on to so tightly was beginning to loosen. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was something to fear or to welcome. Elias had not given him a complex formula for success. He had not listed strategies or handed him a roadmap. Instead, he had given him a simple task: walk with water, observe, balance. And in that simplicity, Ethan had found an answer far deeper than any he had ever received in books or motivational speeches. The truth was not about working harder or sacrificing more. It was about balance. He thought about the first time he had walked through the retreat. His eyes locked on the glass. His entire existence narrowed to the fragile surface of the water. He had felt proud of himself when he returned without spilling a single drop, believing that control, precision, and focus were what made the difference. But when Elias asked him what he had seen along the way, he had nothing to offer. His journey had been devoid of experience, empty of beauty, blind to the world around him. The second time, he had allowed himself to look up, to notice, to feel. He had walked the same path, but this time, he had seen life unfolding before him, the golden petals of wildflowers reaching toward the sky, the way the sunlight painted patterns on the stone pathways, the sound of the river weaving through the air like a quiet song. And yet, in shifting his focus, he had spilled some of the water. Standing before Elias now, he saw the lesson clearly. If one only focuses on the goal, life will pass by unnoticed. If one only focuses on the experience, responsibility will slip away. Neither extreme led to success. The true path was learning to walk with both, to hold ambition in one hand and presence in the other. For years, Ethan had seen his life as a race, a series of boxes to check, achievements to collect, milestones to reach. He had measured his worth in output, in progress, in how much closer he could get to some distant version of himself that he had not yet become. He had sacrificed relationships, missed celebrations, ignored moments of stillness, all because he had been convinced that success required suffering. That joy was a distraction. That balance was for those who lacked ambition. Now, he saw the fallacy in his thinking. Success was not a mountain to conquer at any cost. Nor was it a fleeting state one stumbled upon through sheer luck. It was something far more delicate, far more intentional. It was the ability to strive without losing sight of the moment. It was knowing when to push and when to pause, when to narrow focus and when to widen perspective. It was the understanding that ambition and presence were not opposing forces, but two parts of the same whole. Elias's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and unwavering. The world will tell you that success comes only to those who sacrifice everything for it. But what they do not tell you is that the highest achievers are not the ones who run themselves into exhaustion, but the ones who learn to move with purpose. Success does not come to those who sprint blindly, nor to those who wander without direction. It belongs to those who can walk the path with awareness, those who can hold the glass without spilling all the water, but also without forgetting to see the world. Ethan exhaled, his grip on the glass loosening slightly. He thought back to all the nights he had spent working late into the hours of dawn, convincing himself that if he just endured a little longer, just pushed a little harder, everything would fall into place. He had prided himself on his discipline, his ability to sacrifice, his relentless work ethic. But had it brought him happiness? Had it brought him fulfillment? Or had it simply drained him of the very things that made life worth living? The answer was clear now. Hard work mattered. Dedication mattered. But they were not the only things that mattered. A life spent chasing without ever appreciating was a life half-lived. And true success, the kind that was both deeply personal and undeniably fulfilling, came not from extremes, but from balance. He looked at Elias and nodded. Not because he felt he had fully mastered the lesson, but because he knew it was the first time he truly understood it. The real work would not be in this moment of realization, but in carrying this wisdom with him beyond the walls of the retreat. It would be in the choices he made each day, the way he structured his time, the way he pursued his ambitions, the way he allowed himself to experience joy without guilt. It would be in the way he learned to hold success and life together. Instead of choosing between them, Elias gave him a knowing look, as if he could see the shift happening inside him. "It is not enough to hear wisdom," he said. "You must live it." Ethan turned, glass still in hand, and walked away from the retreat. But this time, he walked differently. Not with urgency, not with the weight of expectation pressing down on him, but with awareness, with intention, with balance, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. Ethan stood at the edge of the retreat, his mind still lingering on Elias's words. He had come here expecting strategies, techniques, something concrete that would finally push him past the invisible barrier that had kept him from success. Instead, he had been given something far more elusive, an understanding that success was not about running faster or working harder, but about learning how to move with balance. He had never considered that the way he pursued his goals might be just as important as the goals themselves. As he walked away from the retreat, the air felt different, lighter, as if he had set down something heavy he had been carrying for years without realizing it. But despite the clarity he had gained, a quiet voice inside him asked the question he wasn't yet ready to face: what now? It was one thing to understand a lesson. It was another to live it. And if he was honest with himself, he didn't know if he could. When he arrived back home, the familiar world of deadlines, expectations, and responsibilities rushed toward him like a wave trying to pull him under. His inbox was overflowing. Missed calls from colleagues blinked on his phone. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the weight of it all pressing against his chest, urging him to fall back into his old patterns. The world had not changed just because he had. The same demands, the same pressures, the same endless pursuit of more still surrounded him. And for a moment, he wondered if it was even possible to hold on to the lesson he had learned. He sat at his desk, his hands hovering over the keyboard, prepared to dive back into the familiar rhythm of constant work. But something made him stop. He glanced out the window, where the sun was setting, spilling gold and amber across the sky. He couldn't remember the last time he had really looked at a sunset. The last time he had allowed himself to witness something beautiful without feeling like it was a distraction. He had always been too busy, too focused, too determined to waste time on things that didn't move him forward. But wasn't that exactly what Elias had tried to show him? That success wasn't about reaching a destination at the expense of the journey itself. He closed his laptop and stepped outside. The city buzzed around him. People rushing, cars honking, everyone moving as if they were being chased. He realized that, not long ago, he had been one of them, moving so fast that he had barely registered the world around him. But now, he slowed his steps. He breathed. He let himself be part of the moment rather than just passing through it. It felt foreign at first, almost wrong, as if he were breaking some unspoken rule about what it meant to be successful. But then, something deeper settled in, an understanding that had been waiting for him all along. He wasn't falling behind. He was finally moving at a pace that allowed him to see. The change didn't happen all at once. There were days when he slipped back into his old ways, when the pressure to do more, to be more, pulled him into late nights and endless work. But each time, he caught himself sooner. He learned to listen to the quiet voice inside him that reminded him to pause, to breathe, to be present. He started measuring success not just by his accomplishments but by the depth of his experiences, by the relationships he nurtured, by the way he felt at the end of each day. He still worked hard. He still cared about his goals. But he no longer believed that success had to come at the cost of everything else. One evening, as he sat on his balcony, watching the lights of the city flicker like stars in reverse, he thought about Elias and the retreat, about the lesson that had seemed so simple yet had changed everything. He had spent his entire life holding his success like that glass of water, gripping it so tightly that he had been afraid to look away, to enjoy the view, to live. But now, he understood. Success was never about keeping the glass full at all costs. It was about learning how to hold it while still allowing himself to see, to feel, to be part of the world. For the first time, Ethan did not feel like he was running towards something in the distance. He was exactly where he needed to be. And that, he realized, was success. Ethan had always believed that success was about moving forward, about never stopping, never slowing down. He had thought that the moment he paused, the moment he allowed himself to rest, he would lose momentum and fall behind. But now, as he moved through his days with a different awareness, he realized that it had never been about speed. It had never been about grinding endlessly toward a distant finish line. Success was not something waiting for him in the future, it was something he had to create in the present. At first, the change felt unnatural. He had spent years living a certain way, measuring his worth by how much he accomplished, how productive he was, how much further ahead he was compared to yesterday. Letting go of that mindset didn't happen overnight. There were moments when he found himself slipping back, reaching for his phone before bed to check his emails, feeling the itch to work late just for the sake of working, convincing himself that if he wasn't exhausted, he wasn't doing enough. But each time, he stopped. Each time, he reminded himself of what he had learned. It was not about abandoning ambition. It was about moving through life with intention. He still had goals. He still wanted to achieve. But he was learning to do it differently. He no longer sacrificed his well-being for the sake of progress. He no longer ignored the people around him in pursuit of something that had no real meaning without them. He no longer let his life become a checklist of accomplishments, each one empty the moment it was completed because there was always another waiting in line. For the first time, he allowed himself to experience life fully. He noticed things he had once overlooked, the way the morning light streamed through his window, the way his coffee tasted instead of just using it as fuel, the way laughter felt when he was present enough to truly enjoy it. He had spent so long believing that these moments were distractions, that they were indulgences he couldn't afford. But now, he understood that they were what made the journey worth it. Success was not about how much he could endure. It was about how much he could experience. He restructured the way he worked, not by doing less, but by working with clarity. He set boundaries, not because he wanted to escape his responsibilities, but because he wanted to be fully engaged in whatever he was doing, whether it was work, relationships, or simply sitting in stillness. He no longer believed in the myth of endless hustle. He saw now that real progress came from balance, from knowing when to push forward and when to step back. The people around him noticed the change. They asked why he seemed different, why he no longer carried the same restless energy, why he no longer looked like he was constantly at war with time. He had no simple answer for them. How could he explain that he had spent years chasing something that had been within his reach all along? That he had believed success was a finish line when it had always been the way he walked the path. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sun sink below the skyline, he thought about who he had been before. The man who had believed that success was something he had to suffer for. The man who had equated self-worth with productivity. The man who had been afraid to slow down because he thought slowing down meant giving up. He realized now how much he had misunderstood. Success was not about proving himself. It was about knowing himself. It was about creating a life he did not need to escape from. A life that did not feel like a constant race towards something undefined. As the city lights flickered on, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the fleeting kind that came with temporary victories. Not the conditional kind that depended on achieving something first. But a quiet, steady peace that came from knowing he was exactly where he needed to be. He was still moving forward, still growing, still working toward his dreams, but now, he was doing it in a way that allowed him to live, to breathe, to be present, and that, he realized, was the kind of success he had been searching for all along. Ethan had spent so much of his life believing that success was something external, something to be reached, something to be earned through endless effort. He had measured himself against impossible standards, convinced that he would only be worthy once he had accomplished enough. But standing at the crossroads of understanding, he realized that his entire approach had been flawed. Success was not about reaching a final destination. It was about the way he moved through life. The way he allowed himself to be present. The way he balanced ambition with fulfillment. He thought about the years he had spent running toward an idea of success that was always just out of reach. He had convinced himself that happiness would come later, that rest could wait, that there was no room for anything but relentless pursuit. And yet, when he looked back at those years, what did he see? He saw moments of exhaustion mistaken for progress. He saw opportunities for joy that had been ignored. He saw relationships that had been pushed aside in the name of productivity. He saw a version of himself who was always striving but never arriving. He had believed that success required sacrifice. And while there was truth in that, he now understood that the greatest sacrifice would have been to reach his goals only to realize he had lost himself along the way. He saw now that fulfillment was not something that appeared at the end of hard work, but something that had to be cultivated in the process. Success was not a trade-off between ambition and happiness. It was the ability to hold both, to walk the path with intention while still allowing space for life to unfold in ways he could not control. He no longer felt the same urgency to prove himself. He no longer believed that every second of his life had to be optimized for achievement. He still wanted to grow, still wanted to build, still wanted to achieve. But now, he also wanted to live. He wanted to wake up in the morning and feel a sense of excitement, not just for what he would accomplish, but for how he would experience the day. He wanted to be present in his conversations, to laugh without feeling guilty, to work with focus but also with ease. He wanted to look back at his life and see not just a list of achievements, but a collection of moments that had made the journey worthwhile. He thought about Elias and the way the old master had spoken with such certainty, not about the mechanics of success, but about its essence. He realized now that the greatest wisdom did not come from strategies or formulas, but from perspective. It came from the ability to see beyond what the world told him he needed to be, to redefine success on his own terms. The path to fulfillment was not something that could be found in external validation, nor was it something that could be measured by productivity alone. It was something deeply personal, something that had to be lived, something that had to be felt. For the first time in his life, he gave himself permission to slow down, not to stop, not to abandon his dreams, but to walk with more awareness, more gratitude, more balance. He allowed himself to appreciate the space between his achievements, to find meaning not just in the milestones but in the everyday moments that made those milestones matter. He stopped seeing time as something he had to conquer and started seeing it as something he could embrace. He no longer felt weighed down by the expectations he had once carried so heavily. He no longer felt that success was something he had to chase with relentless desperation. He understood now that it was something he could nurture, something that could exist alongside joy, alongside presence, alongside the richness of a well-lived life. He did not have to choose between ambition and peace. He could have both. As he stood at the edge of this understanding, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. A quiet kind of freedom, not from responsibility, not from the desire to achieve, but from the illusion that he had to sacrifice his happiness to be worthy of success. He had been searching for a secret, a missing piece. But he realized now that the answer had been with him all along. It was never about working harder, pushing further, sacrificing more. It was about learning how to walk the path in a way that allowed him to experience life as he built his future. And so, as he moved forward, he did not do so with the same frantic energy that had once driven him. He did not measure his days by how much he had accomplished, but by how deeply he had lived. He still pursued his dreams, still worked toward his goals. But he did so with a newfound sense of clarity. He understood now that success was not a point in time, not a place he would one day reach, but a state of being. It was in the way he approached his work, in the way he showed up for himself and for others, in the way he allowed himself to be present in the unfolding of his own life. He had spent years searching for the key to success. But now he saw that the key had never been hidden. It had always been there, waiting for him to recognize it. Success was not something that existed in the future. It was something he could hold right now, in this moment, in the way he chose to live. And with that understanding, he took his next step, not as someone chasing success, but as someone who had finally found it within himself.